I'm Jason Bradford.
I'm Asher Miller.
And I'm Rob Dietz. Welcome to Crazy Town, where the only way to make ends meet as a sustainable farmer is to sell your gourds on OnlyFans. In this episode, Chris Smaje visits Crazy Town for some farmer-to-farmer straight talk with Jason Bradford. Are these two long-lost cousins? Both dropped out of academia years ago to become philosophizing farmers. Can we just call them farmers with a PH, as in PhD? Chris's latest book, Finding Lights in a Dark Age, Sharing Land, Work, and Craft, explores how we can move from modernity's unsustainable political economy toward a reorganization of society driven by communities and local food systems. In this wide-ranging conversation, Chris and Jason cover everything from Viking raids to agrarian populism, from societal collapse to the practicalities of making your way in a failed state. And they can't get away from the shop talk of gardens, livestock, and home economics. Enjoy.
So there's this guy in the United Kingdom, right? You heard of that place?
Have?
Does it start with a Lord, Sir?
I don't think so, but he's like a former academic, but sociology, I believe is what it was. He wrote this book, Finding Lights in a Dark Age, Sharing Land, Work, and Craft. Who am I talking about?
Sharing land, working craft?
Work and craft.
Oh, work and craft.
Who am I talking about?
King Arthur.
Wait, let me think about this.
I'm just thinking of British people here.
He's a farmer now.
Mr. Bean.
God, I'm talking
I'm
about.
trying to think about British people.
I'm talking, Chris Smaje.
Oh,
right?
Chris, right, of course.
Okay, so he's like, he writes more books than I do. He's got a farm.
He's a better farmer
probably
than you
a way
are.
better farmer than I am.
Smarter, better looking.
I think so.
Eats a better diet.
Has a
He's a
better
better
accent.
tennis coach than
I
you
know.
are. He birds way better than you do.
I don't know about that. But anyhow, I'm excited because I feel like we've kind of been living these parallel lives, but on different sides of the pond or so they say, And I'm even on the other side of the
I
continent.
mean, parallel, but he's the real thing, and you're like Chris Smaje light.
Probably. But anyway, I'm going to do
You're
it.
a smidger. He's a smage.
I'm a smidgen of Smaje. Yeah. But I'm kind of excited to talk to him because, I mean, face it, finding lights in a dark age, I have some pretty gloomy views about like what it's going to be like as we deal with the great unraveling, blah, blah, blah. And his book is not like all puppy dogs and unicorns and Loch Ness monsters, but it's, anyway, mythological creatures.
It's not all puppy dogs, unicorns, and Loch Ness monsters.
Like I say, I don't make sense all the time, but Chris makes a lot of sense. Right?
Well, let's get him on then.
So wait, you're going to talk to him about Loch Ness Monster?
Now, sharing land, work, and craft.
Right. I mean, Chris, so here we are giving you a hard time. Chris is great. I'm looking forward to your conversation with him. We published a lot of Chris's stuff over the years at resilience.org. We've actually talked about Chris before because I don't even know what episode. You guys always remember episode numbers. I don't remember episode numbers. I just remember we talked about Chris because there was a kind of a brouhaha between him and George Monbiot a little bit.
On the whole, can you use technology to solve our problems or not? And
Yeah. And
Can you feed people with vats of bacterial sludge?
you
Probably.
had me at bacterial sludge.
Yeah. No, you can't. And
that sounds delicious. I can't wait for that.
Chris knocked
You're
that
going
one
to talk
out.
to Chris about that, right? Like
Not
recipes?
Not too much.
No?
I think we've dealt with that. So I'm looking forward to this and hope people give it a listen. You open your book with this sort of theoretical look of like a Google Earth kind of flyover.
Right.
And you kind of start in Los Angeles and you go across the U.S., Midwest, and the East Coast, and you go up into Northern Europe and kind of come back down to your area. And the title of your new book is Finding Lights in a Dark Age. And part of the imagery is that, in this future flyover, assuming, you can actually have satellites that can give you this imagery, there's not as many lights. And maybe Las Vegas isn't glowing anymore.
Yeah.
I guess make that connection then between what we're doing and this belief that you and I both have that we're facing this kind of crisis, multifactorial, but energy being part of it.
The reality basically is that the distribution of the global population now is massively urban and massively not really in centres of that are promising agriculturally. That will change.
Right.
I sort of play on the idea of dark ages in various ways. One, when you fly over the earth now, particularly all the richer countries, you just see all the light, of the cities and the highways and so on. So there is a kind of literal sense of a dark age of less energy, which has all sorts of implications. But the dark age idea really is more of a social, economic, political one. The idea of a dark age when a civilization falls that I'm kind of play with as well in the book.
Yeah, the idea that the Western Roman Empire collapsed and what that did for like where you live, the changes that happened is really interesting.
Right.
You're kind of playing on dark age as this, everyone thinks it's a boogeyman, when in a sense, that's sort of a misconception, at least in part, as all bad. So what is a little bit maybe of those misconceptions? Why are dark ages all so bad?
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, if we look at historical dark ages, post-Roman Western Europe or whatever, or, Britain is a good example where, one historical narrative is, the Romans brought civilization to us wild Britons here and gave us baths and mosaics and things and, wasn't that great? But the reality is that they were an invading colonial power, and the evidence from archaeology and so on seems to suggest that once the Romans left Britain, the sort of ordinary, average, everyday Briton was better off, better nutrition, so... And the thing is, we get these sort of historical narratives about the collapse of Rome or whatever come down to us from elites, from the literate people. So it's like,
Right.
oh, it's all falling apart. It's terrible, but the reality of those situations was often, more taxation to sort of fund the kind of centralized polity, more military conscription, more militarized societies. So what is called a dark age, because it kind of disappears from history a little bit, from a perspective of ordinary people, was often quite good. And all sorts of interesting gender aspects to that, where extractive commercialized farming tends to become more patriarchal, for example, whereas it's kind of better gender relationship. Obviously I'm generalizing, but so I kind of try and play with that idea in the book. I mean, what I would say is that I don't want to sort of create this sense that I'm arguing, it'll be great when we lose fossil fuels and society collapses, because we now, I think, are in a kind of a different situation, which is much more challenging. So I don't want to sort of suggest that the picture is rosy. But the other aspect of this is that we don't seem to have any real, apart from marginal people like you and me, we haven't really got any sort of mainstream political narratives of how we get out of this. We have the techno fix narrative. So I think it will emerge out of crisis, and that will involve suffering, but that's already baked. I mean, there's already suffering built into the existing model. That's already baked in. It's not a case of keeping the existing show on the road at all costs. There are ways that we can respond to it, and people are creative, when forced to be. The problem really is the transition and the speed of the transition. The problem is not the fact that we can't create a congenial livelihood in kind of small scale agrarian societies. We know that we can.
You had a really also early discussion in the book, this fascinating story of Vikings, and the idea that there was sort of this environmental catastrophe happen, and it was just sort of it was a climate shift happened, a little ice age kind of thing, and nobody was at fault. But what it did is it kind of kicked off this reaction by Vikings, and you now sort of make the case that in some ways that was like the start of the madness we've had to deal with for the next 1,500 years or so. Can you unpack that a bit?
There was these big volcanic eruptions in the 6th century, just prior to kind of late Iron Age, just prior to the Viking expansion that created this volcanic winter, kind of like a nuclear winter that just devastated Northern Europe. And the result of that was a time of violence, basically, in which the sort of warrior aristocracies emerged. And that was sort of the genesis. Previously it had been small-scale farmers operating within these kind of petty kingdoms, but it created this real kind of expansionary, militarized, aristocratic kind of world. And that was, the genesis of the Viking period. And again, I sort of play with that in the sense that, everyone talks about the way that the Vikings connected people. They were great traders. They cracked a lot of heads, but they also connected people and traded. Of course, one of the major trade items was slavery, and that became a sort of self-reinforcing cycle of, more slaves, more production, more ships, more raiding, and so on. And so I kind of play with that idea in the sense that that is the modern world. The modern world has been built on this kind of nexus of trading and raiding and slaving. And although nowadays, it's all more genteel, although slavery, of course, does still exist worldwide, it's not a kind of major legal trade. And we've sort of fooled ourselves into thinking that we've got this whole modern narratives of, the wealth of nations, that trading is a good thing. And I'm certainly not arguing that there should be no trade. But it is kind of a Viking world, it's a world of getting competitive advantage, sort of getting profit, that whole kind of nexus of political and economic and military power, colonialism and so on. So that is, that's one model, that's one way the world has gone, and that's, we are the sort of inheritors of that in a way, arranging all this sort of trade goods to come to our doors via Amazon or whatever from anywhere in the world, with these murky power relations behind it all.
Instead of having the ships that you're oaring and these guys with these horns on their helmets, they're flying across the oceans and they're landing and they put on a three-piece suit and they go into meetings and they're financing new factories being built, and they're financing, the modernization of farming in another country so that you can export instead. And we made it pretty.
But the horns are still, underneath the suit, the horns are still there, So, that's one way it could go. But the other way it can go, I sort of play with that idea, but I think we have this model that comes out of Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan and all that sort of thing, that unless we have a kind of state, unless we have a strong government, then, we're all at each other's throats, and, it's sort of dog eat dog, and the top dog wins. That is one model of society that is undeniably exists and always has and always will. But there's other aspects too, and generally, if you look at global history, people are pretty good at kind of figuring out collaborative ways of working. I mean, it's one thing that distinguishes us from our great ape cousins, is we're better at actually coming up with peaceful collective arrangements. And people are very, very creative in terms of figuring out how to generate low impact, more or less sustainable livelihoods, and with often very subtle, more subtle, I think, in many ways than our modern thinking about property and land, the sort of subtle complexities around what do I produce as an individual or within my family or household, when do I come together and work with other people on larger scale projects, how do we share out access to resources. So, there's a whole history, complex history, that's often very specific to place, but I guess more general, wider principles behind it. I think that needs emphasizing as well. And that for sure is what we need to be working on in the future, I think, to avoid that Viking outcome.
Yes.
We have this whole narrative of progress and modernization and how wonderful it's been, and I don't want to deny that. I mean, I possibly don't big it up as much as I might, because there's plenty of other people doing that, but we don't talk about the downsides. We don't talk about what we've lost and where we're going, where this so-called progress is taking us.
Yeah, I once listened to a Wendell Berry speech that was given at like a World's Fair that was in Spokane, Washington, I don't know, like 50, 60 years ago or something like that. And It's exactly what needs to be said today. Like things haven't changed. I remember when I started realizing that these incredibly articulate people who are like considered national heroes have been saying the same kind of thing
Yeah.
for decades, and I'm like a 35-year-old guy who just goes, "Oh no, what can I say that's going to make any difference if these people haven't had any luck?"
Yeah.
And so a part of me is like, it almost has to fail before people will figure it out, which is
Mm.
sad.
The reality basically is that the distribution of the global population now is massively urban and massively not really in centres of promising agriculturally. And so that will
Right.
change.
A lot of people, when you bring up ruralization and getting people back into the countryside, a lot of people sort of steeped in these modern progress myths are worried. They're like, "Well, you put everybody out there, they'll destroy the place."
Mm.
And I always go like, "Have you been out there and seen what it's like? It's already pretty messed up." And,
Yeah.
like, personally, what I need is I need help. I need people to help me plant these trees. I need people that,
Yeah. Yeah.
help me do these restoration projects, restore native grasslands where I can. Like, those are manual labor jobs,
Yeah.
and people paying attention and caring for a place. Nothing seems to be cared for anymore because these people are driving around in these giant
Mm.
machines,
Mm.
trying to make their 8% margin if they have a good
Mm.
year. What do you think this comes from, this notion?
Yeah, it's kind of funny how almost all other job sectors, it's what people say, great, we've created more jobs in this. Whereas
Yeah,
farming, it's always like, oh, it's
yeah.
great. We've mechanized this. There's even less people needed now. I mean, I think it partly comes from this progress narrative, which is not a very well examined one. That the kind of arc of history is away from farming and towards urbanism. And, I think a lot of urban people, I think you're right. They don't necessarily see, you live in the city and then you probably go to a national park for your holiday. You
Right,
don't
right,
go to
right.
some massive, farm in Iowa or something.
Industrial farm.
So you
Yeah,
think, oh,
yeah,
nature,
yeah.
nature looks great in Yosemite or something. I'm glad
Right, right.
we've got this situation of overproduction in farming where the economic incentives work. It's like, let's crank out more stuff, let's buy all these inputs and crank out more and more stuff, to try and sort of, it's kind of a race to the bottom where you're always sort of producing more to try and
Yeah,
stay afloat. And then it's like, well, let's add value by feeding it to livestock or making it into biofuels or whatever. And, the whole thing is massively, and typically in places that are potentially quite ecologically fragile, and we shouldn't really, growing soy in Brazil or whatever,
right.
So, but,
Yeah, ridiculous.
I think it partly comes from that. It partly comes from this critique of, this sense that people talking about back to the land or farming, it's kind of this nostalgic, let's turn the clock back to the good
Mhm,
old days. And there can be an element of truth to that critique, but also
mhm.
a lot of what happened that pushed people off the land, was expropriation. It was the enclosure of the commons. It was
Yeah,
violent removal of people from the land. It wasn't this wonderful process of Dick Whittington going to London to make his fortune kind of thing. And I think also there's an element of self-justification. It's like, well, I quite like my rich
mhm.
urban job and I don't really want to go and work on the farm. But as you say, a lot of people do. A lot of people absolutely want to do the kind of work that we do and that sort of diverse,
Right,
interesting mixed farming. And you also get the kind of thing that crops up a lot. I sort of comes my way is like, oh, you're like the Khmer Rouge. You want to force people at gunpoint. To sort of
yes,
fit in with your.
yes,
I mean, I've had this with my previous book, and it's
yes,
like I don't
yes,
want anyone to sort of have to do anything or go where they don't want to. But if
right,
we don't start talking about this, if we don't sort of face the biophysical reality of energy constraint and energy decline, it's going to get pretty nasty. So, this is not me
right.
not me trying to enforce my vision of ruralism on people. It's like, guys, look over your
Yeah,
shoulder, look what's coming.
Hi, this is Rob. I've gotten a lot of joy, friendship, and insight from hanging out with Jason and Asher here in Crazy Town, even when they're laughing at me instead of with me. I love doing this show, getting the chance to process the insanity of modern techno-industrial society and coming up with ideas for how we can do something different, like repair ecosystems and make our communities more resilient. If you'd like a chance to interact with the three of us and share some stories and laughs, we've got a special event for you. It's the Crazy Town Hall. Come join us for this live online event on June 23rd, 2026 at 5 p.m. U.S. Pacific Time, 8 p.m. Eastern. It is a fundraiser, so you will need to make a donation to the Post-Carbon Institute to get a ticket to this clown show. Town hall. In all seriousness, we love our Crazy Town listeners, and I hope you'll join us at the town hall. To register, please visit resilience.org/crazytownhall. That's resilience.org/crazytownhall. One more time, resilience.org/crazytownhall. See you there.
Like you say, some people are already interested in this prior to sort of the big collapse we're talking about. There's somewhat of a collapse already happening, kind of in faith in the system. And so there are some people sensitive, like you and I were when we were, 20 years ago, sensitive to these right now and are trying to move out of the city. They're trying to get into these farming systems. So tell me about then what you've done. You say you took some land that was sort of what you might call bare farmland, let's say. There's not a lot on it. It was a field maybe just used by a neighboring farmer for their crop rotation, and now you've converted into sort of this mixed use thing?
Yeah, exactly so. I mean, originally it was one field in a larger dairy farm, basically permanent pasture, kind of semi-improved permanent pasture. And it was just owned by a farmer whose main farm was elsewhere that, he just put his cows on it occasionally. So, yeah, we bought it and we planted 7 acres of woodland on it, which was whole interesting issues about wood and woodland plantation, but that's worked out really well in all sorts of ways. It's really made the place in lots of ways. And, the wood is now, I get a lot of pleasure from seeing these trees towering over me now and, lots of uses out of that.
Yeah.
We've got some pasture at the moment. We've just got a few sheep on it. The main commercial thing we've done is a little market garden. So in 2008, we started a market garden growing local veg, which we sell to people in town. I set that up along with my wife, and I was the sort of more than full-time grower for 5 years, and then she did it for a while. And now we've got some younger people with more energy and muscle than we now do doing it, but it's still going. So that's a nice, so we've still got that aspect of the site, but sort of increasingly we've moved more into what you might call homesteading, I guess, over in the States. I don't know, sort of, gardening and orchards and sort of fruit and nut, mostly for ourselves. We've got various people living on the site, changing cast of characters over the years, and various kind of educational projects. We've got a forest school that kind of takes kids and young people sort of in various categories of need and so on, and sort of brings them out here and does educational stuff with them. But yes, I've sort of drifted off into writing books in recent years as well. So that's always my tension, I suppose.
Right. Well, that makes sense in a way. You get older, your joints aren't quite as limber, your back might go out at least, and it makes sense to pass on sort of the hard labor aspects to younger people. And you've written 3 books in the last, I don't know, is it 5 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, it is partly passing on. I suppose it's also, I mean, I'm sure as you well know, it's hard to make a sort of food production business work financially, work economically in the modern world. And so to some extent, the writing was driven by, you can sort of know that in the abstract, but it's not until you actually, grow the veg or produce whatever it is you produce and sort of try and sell it. You're like, oh, okay.
No, it's absurd. I've done small veggie stuff, CSAs, and little stand by my farm and sell things, and putting melons in the back of my truck and taking it to a neighborhood to sell, and and you just wear yourself out. You're like, oh, I got a couple $100, it's
Yeah.
just like,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. And people praise you like, oh, it's so
Yeah.
wonderful. I love your produce. Oh my gosh, I want more of your melons. I'm just like, I don't want to grow
Yeah.
any more melons for sale. They're heavy. They're full of water.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's part of what drew me into the writing is like, we kind of know what we need to do, how we need to farm, how we need to look after the land and so on. But, these bigger systems don't really enable that to happen. So that's sort of what drew me back into writing, really, and sort of trying to get my head around what the obstacles were and, how that might all pan out.
I completely agree. Like, there's this idea at first when you're farming, you're going, am I a real farmer if I don't, make a living at this? And eventually I gave myself permission to just do what I could handle
Mm,
and make money somewhere else if I had to. And because it does become an absurdity.
yeah.
And part of what I've done at this place is I've given opportunities for other farmers to do their work,
Mm,
watching them, right, and their struggles to figure it out has been interesting. And I have a lot of tolerance for failure because I understand that, and I'm trying to have small farmers. So
yeah. If you grow veg in your backyard or, do sort of permaculture stuff, you can sort of delude yourself that you're being
mhm,
very productive and very efficient. And I suppose the finances of farming are just crazy and don't stack up. But I guess when you have to focus on, right, got to crank out this amount of produce and I've got to pay for these inputs that cost me, it sort of makes you think in a different and useful way. But the ultimate conclusion of that is that this global system that we've created is crazy.
yeah. And you had a woodlot, for gosh sakes. People probably think you're insane. Like, what are you doing planting trees on what could be a productive pasture for cows? But you're thinking about energy in the future and coppicing and having maybe materials to make, I don't know, wattle and daub housing if we need it or something, right?
Yeah, we're sort of mostly off grid and using the wood to provide sort of heat and hot water in the winter, starting to use it for constructional uses as well. But
Mhm.
that's a big issue, the way that farming and forestry have been sort of split up and turned into two different things. It's sort of interesting historically where, because wood is, big and heavy, basically people used to grow it where they needed it, because transport costs are
Yes.
huge. Whereas now with
Yeah.
fossil energy, wood is kind of a low value product. So you tend to produce it, as far away as possible on sort of low value land. But again, that's a feature of modern society. We need to claw some of that back
Yeah.
and bring these different aspects of the farmed landscape or the settled landscape back into relationship with one another.
And all the different tasks you can do. I find that if I do the same thing over and over again, I can get pretty bored and I might hurt myself.
Mm,
But a lot of what I get on this mixed farming is I'm task switching all the
yeah,
time. I'm repairing a fence. I'm planting trees. Maybe I'm coppicing. I'm moving the sheep. I'm planting some peas.
yeah.
Like, you can do that all in one day at a modest scale and not hurt yourself and find it very interesting.
I think the way that existing landowners and farmers go will be quite significant in a lot of places, and their model of farming is very, very dependent on energetically costly inputs that will be melting away, and
Right.
b on global commodity markets. And so how that plays out, that can play
Right.
out in a lot of different ways. But my feeling is, a lot of large scale farmers are not making any money at it either and are sort of interested in
Right.
connecting with, stacking small enterprises. And, that's one way it can go.
Mm.
It will also depend on the organization of people moving in. I mean, I talk a little bit in the book about the MST in Brazil, sort of landless workers
Right.
occupying large estates. So, you can have maybe to some extent armed or at least aggressive takeovers of land, which is almost like the flip side of the kind of feudal aristocracy or the landlord
Yes.
society. But what I would hope is to avoid those extreme sort of violent scenarios at either end.
Right.
And there's a lot of different models of the way in which we can come together politically to sort these things out, the role of families, households, small-scale agrarian societies, commons and so on. That sort of middle ground of all of a sudden it's like, hell, we've got to, we've got to start producing more of our livelihood locally. What resources do we have? Well, basically land and people, and those things coming together.
Right.
It's not only about more people coming in, more mouths to feed. It's also, more people coming in, more arms to work, more hands on deck sort of thing. That can play out in a lot of different ways. The more we sort of leave it and assume that all this sort of techno fix or status quo political economies will solve it, the more likely it is to collapse, I think, in sort of rapid, problematic, potentially violent ways.
Right.
That's why I think it's so important for us to be having these conversations and trying to build this up now while we still have the time. And I draw on various frameworks in the book, distributism, agrarian, populism, republicanism, and so on. A lot of this stuff that we've sort of forgotten about, but people, have thought about this for a long time. And again, I think it's part of this progress narrative that we sort of think, anything that people were thinking or writing 100+ or more years ago, that's not relevant now, but it is, these were people that were living in low energy, more localized societies, often societies that had experienced political fracture or violence. How do we build up from that? It's really important to be having these conversations.
I want to then get into some of the nitty gritty of this, because this is a big part of the book. We're so used to this sort of corporate state duopoly, and all the conversations have been about, democracy versus communism or socialism or capitalism. And it's like people's framework is really, really narrow, actually.
Right.
And I do agree with you, like the idea that, we've got these big farms that are depopulated. And instead of the problem being we don't need people because they're going to ruin it, the problem is we don't have enough people to actually care for these places absent the machines.
Yeah.
And the
right.
machines aren't doing a very good job. Can you say anything about this sort of the potential for this more horticultural mixed farming model to actually sustain ourselves like peasants of the past?
There's this narrative that, modern farming is way more efficient or productive. It is more productive per unit labor, when you've got one guy in a massive combine or a tractor, compared to if you're sort of out in your garden producing stuff. But it's not more productive in any other way, really. It's not more productive per acre, which I think is the thing that's often in people's minds, or at least it can be. Apart from productivity per unit labor, I don't think scale is that relevant.
To wash.
Yeah, but as you say, what you're producing in a sort of horticultural situation is a much more diverse diet. The modern agricultural system is very good at producing cheap grains and grain legumes that probably are not that great for us in the quantities we eat them, but not good at, producing the real diversity. But yeah, it's not more productive per acre, really. It's certainly not more productive per unit energy or per unit, agrochemical inputs. So, I don't want to diminish the work that's involved in producing a full livelihood, which, I don't produce all of my own food here. I need to stop writing books and produce more of it.
Right. Yeah.
The real problem, as I said earlier, is the overproduction that we have because it's so easy to produce grains and sort of cereals and grain legumes cheaply in massive quantities. The problem that we have is global overproduction that then feeds into pretty disastrous livestock sector and biofuel sector and so on. So if you are producing your energy locally, living a lower energy, more localized life, diverse whole food production, you can do that on quite a small scale.
Let's get into some of these other ways of thinking about politics, right? And one that you really kind of highlight is this concept of distributism.
Right.
So maybe we start there.
Yeah. One of the original ideas for the book was for it to be more directly about distributism, and in the end it was a sort of mixture of different things. I mean, distributism is interesting. It sort of emerged out of Catholic social teaching, sort of emerged out of, I've forgotten which pope it was, late 19th century pope wrote Rerum Novarum, and it was sort of a document that was attempting to steer, as you mentioned previously, the big clash of the 19th and 20th century was sort of capitalism versus socialism. So, it was either people being turned into landless wage workers at the whim of the market, or it was these kind of huge governmental systems of co-opting labor, and the idea was that it was all kind of equal and the state was acting in the interests of the people, but it wasn't really. So the
Right.
distributist idea was essentially for ordinary people to have access to their own means of production, so a small spread of land, or local artisanal guilds, that you could meet their needs outside of the, for themselves locally, out with these kind of huge modern technocratic systems of capitalism or socialism.
Right.
Part of it was private land ownership, and that scares some hares. And, I sort of come from a traditional kind of left-wing background, but there's a big difference between small scale, distributed, that's where the name comes from. The point is that nobody can accumulate a massive amount of land and then kind of rule the roost, that distributed private land ownership.
Yeah.
And, what private means essentially is that you have a long-term stake in it, that, that you have agency and autonomy and a long-term stake in the land, so that, it's not that you can do whatever you like with it.
Right.
There is kind of local wider control
Yeah.
of what
Zoning.
zoning. Exactly. There's this.
Yeah. Or a land trust that has rules for what you can do. Yeah.
Yeah, we tend to have this kind of dualistic view of private property of, get off my land, or, it's my land and I can do what I like with it.
Right.
But, ownership is more complex than that. But that's the basic idea. So yeah, that's distributism in a nutshell. And I think it was an important movement that sort of got swept aside post-war period of globalization and economic growth and industrialization, and that socialism versus capitalism, the Cold War context, and so on and so on and so on. But, it's like a lot of these things, the time comes around again.
Right.
It looks like that way of thinking lost, but didn't really lose the argument. It kind of lost the political conflict at the time, but those ideas are still waiting for us. And I really think we need to look at them with fresh eyes now, because they can teach us things.
Right.
You get a lot of people who are like, oh, we're so individualistic and capitalist in modern society. We need to all has to be shared, property is theft, or all of this kind of, which I'm kind of sympathetic to up to a point, but
Yeah, me too.
it can be too sort of, it's not a very subtle way of thinking. Either we're all individual and all private property owners and putting up fences around our boundaries, or, it's all collective and it all has to be done and sort of agreed with everybody. And, you get power dynamics in that,
Right.
those kind of shared situations, you get the loudest voices that prevail, and so on, so they're not free of power dynamics, So that's partly why I do favour that kind of small distributed. The kind of basic unit is your household and your garden, and producing stuff for yourself. But then guilds and commons, they will start to emerge. You will have to manage aspects of the larger landscape collectively. And that's,
Right.
that's when you get into the detail. I think there's a danger of sort of trying to run before we can walk, or sort of assuming that the higher collective level is the right level or the best one, and often it isn't. It's got to be more musical than that.
And it's like a Humpty Dumpty problem where we destroyed these peasant cultures.
Yeah.
And it's like putting them back together again is not, you can't just explain it to somebody. It's like you have to live it.
Yeah.
And that takes so much time. And it's so much as embodied knowledge.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I think this is the time when we need to be experimenting with, we do need to learn from the past and look
Right.
at how people did this kind of stuff in the past, but not just to mindlessly replicate it, but to see
Right.
why they did it and sort of the ways in which it worked or not. But equally, in modern times, use what we have available now and recognize that we are de-skilled and just experiment with lots of
Hmm.
different ways of doing things. And that's partly, again, coming from a sort of traditional left-wing perspective. I talk quite a lot about family and kinship in the book, and that's kind of a bit of a no-no on the
Yes.
left. It's like, families, it's kind of conservative and old-fashioned and reactionary. But every culture, family, it's almost like humans like structure. We like to create, to formalize things, and kinship is a way of doing that. And it's particularly interesting, I think, in agrarian societies where you tend to have a relatively small household unit, but a wider sort of kinship, and that can
Right.
work in all sorts of ways. I mean, one of the most interesting things that I touch on in the book, I think, is matrilineal kinship, which tends to be
Yeah.
associated with horticultural societies. So a woman with her own private garden, essentially, and being
Yeah.
inherited by her daughter.
Yeah.
Again, it's kind of interesting in terms of some of our stereotypes about gender and private property and all this stuff being sort of patriarchal capitalism. It can sort of
Right.
divide up in different ways. But, kinship is interesting in that it's kind of extendable, and it can connect
Right.
with farming where, there are times in the farming year when you need a lot of labor and you kind of reach out or find ways of connecting with other people, and then other times, sort of lower intensity times. So, part of the book is like, don't dismiss kinship, but also don't dismiss non-kin neighborhoods,
Right.
commons, working with other people, experimenting in all sorts of different ways. We need to do this and figure out what works for us in our contemporary settings, for sure. And also fictive invented kinships. It's like the way we call people brother or sister or cousin or whatever,
Yeah.
it's,
Oh my
you
gosh.
know,
Oh, aunties and stuff.
yeah, it's partly about how we model the relationship.
You know, we have this reverence right now in this sort of liberal modernism of indigeneity and these simple aesthetic ways, and very little desire for most people to actually live like that. Is there any sort of way you see that this dark age forces this, like an alignment more between what we say our values are, what we say we care about, and what we actually have to do?
We're still in this stage where more and more people are seeing the writing on the wall, I think, but it's still sort of
Yeah.
marginal. But as we were discussing earlier, the way that the state will increasingly, the centralized state will increasingly fail people, and people will have to invent,
Mhm.
along the lines you were just saying, kind of make it up for themselves. And so I think that will be a time of, enormous stress and difficulty, but also enormous invention and creativity, both practical creativity, but also cultural creativity.
Yeah, I like that. You get at the fact that the culture is gonna evolve in ways that we can't really predict.
Yeah.
I kind of see that in the sense of awe I get and reverence and, like, how much I care for this land, this place I'm at. The rainbows and the baby lambs and
Yeah.
the river. I'm not religious in any way, but there is something that I think maybe ties me to this place now,
Hmm.
or I sort of feel like, in a sense, you get into this like natural law and virtues. In a sense, there's things that are more important to me about this place and who I want to be in relation to it now
Mm.
than I would have imagined, just living in a city and not having a farm.
Yeah.
How does this play out, you think, over time as people move and become integrated into maybe these more rural communities?
Like you, I come from a secular background, and I've just been feeling my way quite cautiously towards a more spiritual and religious vision. And I do think one of the problems that we have in modernism is we've kind of said, we don't need God anymore, forget about God. But
Right.
what's happened is instead of worshipping God, we've worshipped ourselves, and
And money.
and money. We've
Yeah.
sort of put ourselves and our institutions in the God slot, and that hasn't actually
Yeah.
turned out very well for us. So I don't know, whether the existing global religions, do they have they've lasted a long time through a lot of ups and
Right.
downs, and and churches, I think, are really key community institutions. Here in Western Europe, it's about the least religious part of the world that exists. But I think that kind of Richard Dawkins moment of, atheism is going to sweep the world, I think we'll be mistaken, So,
I think so too.
it may be that the existing religions kind of reinvent themselves, or it may be that new religions and kind of nature religion, more localist stuff sort of happens. I don't know, but I think you can't sort of just invent a religion.
Right, they evolve.
The people that try and invent an off the peg religion are usually charlatans, and we shouldn't be giving our money to those guys, And then religion, existing organized religion, Christianity, versus perhaps more emerging kind of new age ecstatic sort of religions, or people sort of nature religion, and that touches on what you were just saying with I draw on the anthropologist Marshall Salins, where he talks about immanentism. So it's sort of like a kind of well-grounded local indigenous culture, for example, in New Guinea, small agrarian horticultural societies there, which is very much about, as an individual, you're part of this wider world of sort of spirits and ghosts and ancestors and so on, who are kind of there in your day-to-day life, and who are not necessarily that nice. A lot of these characters or these ancestors, you've got to give them offerings and propitiate them and so on. But then, we've got the sort of more, the global organized religions, which again can be more or less immanent. There's a lot of religion, Catholicism would be an example where you've got sort of local saints and, historically and sort of local shrines and a real sort of sense of localism, versus obviously, you got the Pope in Rome and the stuff coming down from on high. But, it's interesting. I've just been reading this book about medieval period, the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, this notion that as commercialization sort of took off in Europe, this idea of voluntary poverty, of people giving up things and essentially going back to the land in some sense, or going back to the local and to the community. So, again, that's another aspect of all this I think needs more thought. How do we re-engage?
You bring up St. Francis of Assisi, which I think, he was alive probably when there was some Renaissance going on in Italy. Is that the idea? And over commercialized and
I guess he was a little bit before that, but it was the time, it was the kind of lead up into that, as medieval European society started becoming more commercial and more trade.
And he's worried about it, like this over grandiosity. Maybe Venice was kind of insane at that point. And so, like, I know I've been there, the church is very simple. Like, it's interesting. You go to Italy and some of these churches are super ornate, but the church in Assisi was very, very plain.
Right.
And so, and he played plain robes, right? These plain brown robes, and into nature and stuff. So it is very interesting to see these cycles of people that are like, wait a second, we might lose ourselves if we go too far this direction.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, most, throughout the world, most pre-modern cultures, asceticism had its place, and, the idea of a sort of religious renouncer. And in some ways that there was a model for that in farming as well, that, that the good farmer was kind of frugal and modest and, didn't throw their weight around, self-reliant and so on. But with this kind of Viking world that we've created, we've sort of lost that, we've lost that sense that simplicity, or not rank poverty necessarily, and the sort of Franciscan way, the sort of extreme burn all your wealth and sort of, just be on the road, that's not for everybody. But just that sense that model is an admirable one, is something that we can emulate to some degree or learn from. We've kind of lost that in modern society, and there's this sense that no, it's all about creating economic growth and sort of accumulating money and busting all these boundaries and somehow keeping the show on the road. So I think, another thing that's important to look back to is those traditions of asceticism and simplicity. To some extent, the green movement and sort of various elements of ecological thought have carried that forward in modern times, but it's always been quite marginal. It's not really part.
It is interesting. I think, I kind of have a cultural materialism perspective on things. And so what I think will happen, I mean, again, not being prescriptive or overly predictive about anything, is that the ideas that are gonna help people cope with the hard times in the future are gonna then rise again to the fore. And so drawing from the past, a lot of reinvention is gonna happen too. People will come up with these things on their own, but they're gonna rhyme with what someone figured out in the past.
Mm.
And eventually, maybe our culture evolves to mimic more of these indigenous cultures,
Hmm.
And in some ways, it's interesting. I always felt like Catholicism was very good at going somewhere, and it didn't actually like wipe out completely the other culture. Like there was still a bunch of paganism alive in Central and South America. It was really fascinating to see the fusion of the two, like in your local saints, but then also local deities really still there.
Yeah.
Animist kind of religions persist even as Christianity spread
Mm.
in these cultures that were still tied to that local place. But, is 2026 gonna be one of these years where so much breaks in kind of people's normal world that suddenly, Chris Smaje's book is a bestseller?
That would be nice, wouldn't it? At least somebody would be benefiting from the collapse then, Uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, obviously, I don't know. I mean, that's one of the problems of writing about the future is that you can't tell, and you very easily make yourself look foolish. But I think we do need to be focusing on the future because,
Right.
it's clear that the existing system is not sustainable, whether that will collapse this year, whether it will be the war with Iran. It's not going to be one thing like that. It's kind of,
Right.
there will be sort of reverses and recoveries, but I think, the general trend is for more chronic, longer term, deeper, more systemic crisis. And that's an example of it. And I think, I guess we are seeing this kind of global superpower geopolitics where the sort of long modernist period, the European conquest of the Americas, I think, was really significant in terms of creating a global system and the flow of crops
Mhm.
as much as anything, potatoes and maize from the Americas, wheat from the old world, and how that generated a kind of
Mhm.
global food system and Atlantic slavery and sugar production and cotton, all this stuff, And then in more recent times, the Cold War and the US as the sort of global superpower, global policeman, as it were, and sort of
Yeah.
creating global trade and giving military protection. And we're beginning to see that fray and that sort of global geopolitical post-war stability of a kind of US-backed global trading system is kind of falling apart. And obviously we've got, the
Yeah.
geopolitics of China and Russia and the Middle East and so on. So, yeah, I think all of that is boiling up into a world that is going to be very different, very much more unstable, less resilient politically and economically, more challenging. Whether 26 is the year. I mean, one thing I do every year is look at the global energy stats and, all this
Mhm.
stuff very well, but the so-called transition to renewables, and every year you see
Yeah.
that actually more fossil fuels were used,
Yes.
with the exception of the financial crisis and COVID, a little dip, but, the general
Right.
trend is more fossil fuel use every year. It'll probably be different in the coming year. And,
Yeah.
there might come a point when it starts going down, but I think there's still this widespread assumption that, hey, we don't need fossil fuels. We'll transition out of those. We'll have
I
renewables and it will be business as usual again. And, I really, for all sorts of reasons, I think that's not what's going to happen and it's going to be bumpy, But I can imagine people cheerleading, oh, great, fossil energy prices
Right.
are up, it'll push the transition, everything will be good. I don't think it will be, but part of this is that we get more unpredictable, quixotic political leaders like Trump who sort of throw a
Right.
firecracker in a way that, hasn't so much been the case in post-war global politics. So yeah, there's a lot of work for us all to do on the ground, to navigate all of this.
It must be very strange to be, a wage earner living in an apartment in a big city and to become aware of what's going on globally and know and if you like grok how dependent you are and if you maybe you start seeing grocery store shelves start becoming bare of certain items, how many people are going to quickly make these connections and hear through social media, podcasts, the odd mainstream news article now and then about sort of these other ways of maybe going about it.
Yeah.
And I just hope more people get there faster, right? Like you and I got there 20 something years ago for whatever reason. And I still feel like I wish I'd done it sooner because the learning curve is so steep.
Yeah.
But I appreciate books like yours because I learned a lot from that book, and I want to thank you for it. And it was one of the more unique books I've read dealing with this because you and I think, are both in these weird situations where we're dealing with these sort of land questions
Mm,
and new people coming in questions. And it's not theoretical, it's practical.
yeah.
And so your ability to go between sort of that theory and practice on some pretty complex, nuanced, highly contextualized subject matter, I just applaud that. And I'm glad you're a social scientist for doing this because that's not my bailiwick.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's nice to hear. Yeah, I mean, I think people will, part of the problem we have now is, farming is so sort of divorced from most people's experience. I mean, maybe gardening, horticulture is the way to get into this, but we've got this sort of situation of growing inequality in society, a lot of which is around housing prices, and
Mhm.
then
Yeah.
cheap food. It's like we need to have this cheap food produced by these ultimately unsustainable global commodity food systems, that can produce food cheaply. And then,
Mhm.
but it is this period of, capitalism. It's the right word because ultimately it's about accumulating more capital than it can. There are times and places when that can bring benefit to people and, more industry and more good
Right.
things. But ultimately it's about putting more capital in the hands of the people that have a lot of capital in the first place. I think that will become more obvious to people.
Yeah.
But the question is whether it then becomes more of a sort of kind of traditional left wing, let's equalize it more, which obviously needs to happen.
Right.
We need to talk about land reform and housing policy and so on. But the problem goes so much deeper than that. And, ultimately it goes into all of these things we've been talking about farming and local food production.
And then to balance these tensions,
Mm, yeah.
great to finally actually talk to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah. No,
Um,
it's good to meet you.
I've been a big fan of your writing, so thank you so much for all your work. I'm so happy you found a beautiful farm to be able to experience all this with.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to, hearing how things unfold in the future with you. So I want to stay in touch.
Right, great. Yeah, no, that would be good. Yeah, looking forward to keeping the conversation going. So, yeah, thank you. I'll put my horned helmet away for now and work on the connecting with people is the way to go.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard and you want others to consider these issues, then please share Crazy Town with your friends. Hit that share button in your podcast app or just tell them face to face. Maybe you can start some much needed conversations and do some things together to get us out of Crazy Town. Thanks again for listening and sharing.
Crazy town, da 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 da, crazy town.